Good morning. How are you? I have a confession. Today, I think, will be the first time in my entire life that I have ever cheered for the Bengals. While I'm praying for Patrick Mahomes. Hey, I've got a question for you. Think this through. Have you ever been burned? Literally or figuratively? Has someone or something ever burned you? I think it's a universal experience, and if I asked for a show of hands, would there be anyone who didn't raise theirs? You see, the question really isn't, have you ever been burned? The question really comes down to this. Do you still smell like smoke? Have you harbored that burn in your heart and soul? Have you carried that burn in how you live? And has it simply become part of who you are? Harry Truman is the one who famously said, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. We live in a hot culture, have you noticed? And there's not much light, but there's a whole lot of heat and a good amount of smoke. And I think sometimes we misperceive it. A crucible is a refining process. It's a vessel that takes metal that is melted so that it can be refined. And I'm a firm believer in Romans 8:28, that in all things God works for good for those who love Him. That doesn't mean God causes the trials and tribulations, but God works through them. Nelson Mandela was being described and discussed, and they were chatting with Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was dear friends with Nelson. And a reporter made the comment that it was a tragedy that Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in a South African prison during the apartheid regime, 19 of those being in maximum security in a hellhole of a prison. And Desmond Tutu, you know, he's gone to be with God, but he had such a distinctive way of speaking. And he said, no, the 27 years were not a tragedy. They were a necessity, because it gave God the opportunity to change Nelson's heart and equip him for all the good that he had to do. Wow. Sometimes I have to pray to have a faith like that looks beyond the fiery flames and sees how God is protecting and refining and restoring me. My name is Jim Preissig. If we haven't met, it's my great joy and privilege to be one of the pastors here at the Summit. And we are in the book of Daniel, and Ryan has spoken the last 2 weeks on Daniel, and it's just been spot on, beautiful, brilliant. I love how he was able to weave the history with the insights that are so relevant about a story that transpired almost 3,000 years ago. And today, we're going back to Daniel. We're going to the 3rd chapter, and we're not going to be talking about Daniel. We're going to be talking about 3 of his buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Are those names familiar to you? I love the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I love the names. If I could have convinced my wife, and we had 3 sons, we could have named them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Wouldn't that be great? But you got to agree to that early on. I mean, you got to be committed, because you can't just spring that on your spouse. You know what I mean? And you can't do it midstream. You can't have Jimmy and Jenny and then Abednego. That doesn't work. But I mean, think how cool it would be to have your 3 kids, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you ever do that, let me know. I'd just like to be there for the celebration, the baptism. What we're going to see in the story is that oftentimes it's not the big dog, in this case Daniel, that it's attacked. It's those people who support him. Because it's easier to go after the pups than to try to kick the big dog. were in exile with the Jews in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. And here is the story as it unfolds in Daniel chapter 3. And what I'll do is I'll read you the story, and then I'll just punctuate it with some observations as we go. Pick up the thread in verse 8. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your Majesty," notice how they are always kissing up. "Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold. And that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace." Any of this sound familiar? The attitude of absolute intolerance. Talk about a cancel culture. If you don't bow down and worship whatever the idol is of the moment, of the day, of the culture, you're an outcast and threatened. But there were some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Notice any jealousy there? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up. Always the subtle trap. Notice? Always the invitation to bow. Always. In every age, in every culture. And it's no surprise they didn't go after Daniel. As you heard in the last two sermons, Daniel's standing with the king was secure. They went after someone they perceived to be a wee bit more vulnerable. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good." You see, there's always that enticement. There's always that invitation to compromise. It may be in school when everybody seems to be cheating. It may be in the workplace when everyone seems to be cutting ethical corners. It may be in the home where you have the temptation to lie. It may be in your relationships with friends. It may be in your relationship with folks at church. There's always the subtle temptation, the invitation to bow, to bend. Then he goes on. "But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand." You see, the devil is always willing to compromise and bargain with you. The devil will always say, "What do we need to do to back this up? What compromise can we find?" That's clearly what Nebuchadnezzar did. Listen to how that turns out. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from your Majesty's hand. But even if he does not," remember that line, "even if he does not," I want to come back to that. Because that's so good. Because they're saying, we believe that God can save us. But even if he doesn't, it doesn't cause us to doubt our faith in God. "But even if he does not, we want you to know, your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." Now listen, because there's a dramatic change. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I love that. And his attitude toward them changed. Ever have anyone's attitude towards you change when you refuse to bow or bend? his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. I wondered what that would look like, this blazing furnace. And what historians tell us, there would have been a port on the top and a port on the bottom. On the top is where they would have put in wood and whatever was to be burned, and on the bottom they would take on the ash. And it occurred to me, well, I bet that would be just like a chimney, only huge, colossal. And that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into. So, what happened then? This is where it gets really good. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. And Nebuchadnezzar said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound, unharmed. And the 4th looks like the son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. I guess he had another change of attitude. Don't you love that? So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched. Oh, and this is the best part. And there was no smell of fire on them. You know, even if you stand close to somebody who smokes, you smell like it, don't you? Isn't it true? If you go into a house to visit somebody who smokes, you smell like it. And these guys were thrown into the fiery furnace because they would not bend or bow to God, to imitators of God. And they did not burn. Let's unpack this. Let's talk about what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ today. Because make no mistake, it's not a question of if you will be tempted to compromise on your principles, on your faith, on your character. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And how will you respond? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego show us the way. First and foremost, they actually refused to bow. I just finished John Meacham's new book on Abraham Lincoln, There is Light. And it's brilliant. It was a great read. It's good for the soul. Because as imperfect as Abraham Lincoln was, he brought what gifts God had entrusted and melded them with an unwillingness to compromise with integrity. When the South fell in spring of 1865, when Richmond collapsed, Lincoln took a steamboat down from Washington to tour through Richmond. And he was walking through the streets, and emancipated former slaves were cheering him and approaching him. And as they drew near, they fell to their knees. Because literally and figuratively, they had spent their lifetime on their knees. And very gently, very lovingly, Lincoln chided them and said, never bow to any man. Never bow to any human being. Bow only to God. You see, there's the challenge and there is the struggle, because we live, well, let me rephrase that. every culture has struggled with the temptation to bow down to some perceived authority. It may be a person in the likeness of a king or a queen. It may be actually an affinity to power or wealth or influence or fame. Or it may simply be a culture that becomes intolerant of anyone who thinks differently. I think about Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s. And you need to understand that Germany was one of the highest cultivated cultures of the 1930s in so many, many ways. You look at the art and the music before the Nazis, and it's incredible. And the Nazis were democratically elected because tyrants are often elected once, and then democracy ceases to exist. After the fall of the Nazis, Martin Niemöller, who was a Protestant pastor, who was swept up in the entire cultural milieu that believed that Hitler was really the one who defined not only life but theology, he wrote a confession. And this is what he wrote. He said, First they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. You see, that's always the danger. And sometimes it's subtle, and sometimes it's very overt. And you cannot be in the public life or in an influential role without someone demanding that you bow to whatever God, small g, that they construct. In the ministry, it's endemic because so often churches can be so intolerant of their pastors' thinking, preaching, teaching. Paul suffered through that. And in his letter to Galatia, he said this. He said, if I was still trying to please human beings, I would not be pleasing God. And explicit in that statement is the question, to whom, to what will you bow? Because you need to decide that now before the offer of the compromise comes. So first is the temptation to bow to one who is not God. The second is to bend, to compromise with those who offer you, in essence, a deal. What did you do for Martin Luther King Day? Did you do anything? Did you do anything special? It's so easy to just think of it's another day without mail. And it's so much more than that. Because as flawed as Martin Luther King was, he took what skills he had and used them to free a people enslaved. 50 years ago this August, he was in Birmingham to take part of the civil rights movement and to work to protect people who were most victimized. And he was arrested and spent some time in jail. And while he was there, he received an open letter that was published in the newspaper and sent to him in the Birmingham jail from 8 prominent clergymen, they were all men, in that town in that day. And even though the tone was somewhat cordial, it was condemning him for being a disruptor, for someone who participated in civil rights, civil disobedience. And I read the letter. And he wrote it in longhand, and it runs about 15 pages type. So imagine what a stack of papers. But he poured out his heart, and he was so transparent. And I'm reading along in the letter, and I come to this chapter. He writes, there is nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was seen sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I'm reading this and thinking, wow, God has such a good sense of humor. Because here I am. I'm not doing sermon prep. And God smacks me with words of real truth. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar because a higher moral law was involved. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of the chopping blocks before submitting to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. We can never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. But I am sure that if I had lived in Germany during that time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers, even though it was illegal. Oh. What made that all the more powerful is one of the signers of the letter was a rabbi. And it struck me. We will be confronted with what is wrong or even evil. And the temptation is to remain silent, to compromise our conscience, rather than to follow Jesus and to serve God. But then we come to the best part. They did not burn. They did not even smell of smoke. I love that line. But if not, their faith was so great they could say, but if not. When the Nazi juggernaut was rolling over France in spring of 1940 and the British forces were collapsing on Dunkirk, it looked like all would be lost. And a British officer sent a communique laying out a vision of a flotilla of boats that would come from across the channel and rescue the men. But he included in the communique, but if not, that's all he wrote, but if not, ... And everyone then knew the story and understood the scriptural reference. We live in faith because having God as our Savior changes everything. I want to tell you a very personal story. In Monroe, the former church that I served in southern Wisconsin, there was a gentleman there by the name of Rob. Dr. Rob. He was a physician. And he was probably one of the gentlest, tenderest, most compassionate and caring physician, if not man, that I have ever known. When he was a child in California, his family was not wealthy. His father was a laborer. He was an only child. It was his father, mother, and him. And one day, this would have been in the late 1950s, they were in the car, the truck I mean, and their vehicle was T-boned by a drunk driver. And being an old truck, the gas tank exploded, and the vehicle burst into flames. And his father, in the driver's seat, reached out to grab his wife. She was on the side where the vehicle impacted them, and his son. And he grabbed onto his son, and as it was burning, fell out of the truck, pulling his boy with him. Rob's mother perished in the fire. And Rob and his father were burned. Rob more severely. His father, his right side and arm. Rob bore those scars his life. You could see it. You could see it on his face. You could see it on his hands. You could imagine what lay beneath his shirt. But what was so incredible, he was a man of extraordinary faith and the most compassionate physician I have ever experienced. And all those years later, even though his body bore the scars, there was no hint of the stench of smoke, that acrid, burning hatred, animosity at the injustice of it all. No, there was a tender soul that trusted in God and knew that God was there for him. Take a sniff. Because all of us have been burned. All of us have been burned by people or circumstances that may even have scarred us. But do we carry the stench of that? Or do we walk proudly as women and men of faith who will not bow, who refuse to bend, and know that by the grace of God we shall not even smell like smoke?